Rain whispered across endless towers. Welcome, friends. Come linger for a little while and let the noise of your own world fade into the distance. Beyond the glow of crowded skies, forgotten paths, wait where memory outlives empires, and even the mightiest rulers cannot account for every hidden truth. Listen closely, for tonight we follow a trail buried beneath years of silence, where every step leads deeper into the shadows between the stars. The Emperor stood alone beneath the crown of the imperial palace, where the highest chamber looked down upon Coruscant like the eye of some ancient predator. Far below, the endless city burned with ordered light, its traffic lanes moving in golden veins through the night, its towers rising and sinking into haze. Rain whispered against the transparent steel, thin and cold, blurring the world into silver threads. Sheev Palpatine did not look at the storm with wonder, for wonder was a weakness of lesser minds. He watched it as he watched all things, measuring its pattern, its obedience, its usefulness. The summons had come in silence, as all true summons did. No trumpet, no aid, no procession of crimson guards marching across polished stone, only a pulse through hidden channels, a command sent into the deep machinery of the Empire. Within the hour, 3 officers from Imperial intelligence had arrived, pale beneath their caps, carrying a sealed archive cylinder whose existence was not listed in any registry. They knelt because the guards had made them kneel, but they trembled because the Emperor had not yet spoken. Palpatine turned from the window, his black robe trailing softly behind him. "You have disturbed my meditation," he said, and the words were quiet enough that the nearest officer flinched as though struck. The eldest of them, Director Hax Belrin, lowered his eyes and lifted the cylinder in both hands. "Forgive us, Your Majesty. The matter concerns a discrepancy in the old Republic vaults. We believed it required your personal attention." Palpatine's yellowed eyes narrowed, not with surprise, but with interest so cold it seemed to draw heat from the chamber. The cylinder opened with a hiss, and a pale projection shivered into the air. Lines of data rose and braided themselves into a star map, but it was incomplete, wounded by erasures and old encryption scars. At its center glimmered a name almost swallowed by static: Project Veilwake. Beneath it appeared a Republic intelligence seal, pre-war, older than the Clone Wars, and never transferred into Imperial command. That alone was impossible, or near enough to stir the Emperor's displeasure. Belrin swallowed before speaking again. The file was found during a purge of redundant Senate security records. It appears to have been hidden inside a chain of false budget reports dating back more than 20 years. He touched a control on his wrist, and more fragments appeared, brief and sharp as broken glass. Veilwake concerned an experimental hyperspace navigation array designed to identify sealed routes beyond mapped lanes. The project vanished before the war began. No closure report, no personnel recovery, no official destruction order. For a long moment, no sound entered the chamber but rain and the faint hum of the projector. Palpatine stepped closer, and the blue light carved hollows into his ruined face. "Everything that mattered in the Republic passed through hands I controlled," he said. "Every secret agency, every emergency program, every whisper of military research. Yet this did not." The officers did not answer, for there was no safe answer to such a statement. The Emperor lifted one bent finger, and the map shifted, expanding toward the edges of known space. There, in the far reaches beyond ordinary trade routes, a cluster of coordinates flickered and vanished. Not the unknown regions, not exactly, but a ragged borderland of dead beacons, failed surveys, and worlds remembered only by smugglers and ghosts. Palpatine felt no fear as he studied it. He felt irritation, precise and venomous, for something had moved in the dark while he had been building his throne. "Who worked on this?" he asked. Belrin signaled the next file, and names drifted upward one by one, most marked deceased, missing, or absorbed into the Imperial system long ago. Scientists, astrogators, code breakers, officers without distinction. Then one name appeared with no death mark, no capture record, and no Imperial reassignment. Palpatine read it before Belrin spoke. Sarah Vant, Republic Intelligence Analyst, Strategic Cartography Division, presumed killed during the Jedi Temple Uprising. "Presumed," Palpatine said, and the word became a blade. Belrin bowed lower. "There was confusion during those days, Your Majesty. Many records were damaged, and several bodies were identified by rank rather than by full genetic scan. The Emperor's face did not change, but the air thickened around him. One of the younger officers began to breathe too quickly, and the sound annoyed him. With a slight movement of Palpatine's hand, the man's breath stopped. His gloved fingers clawed at his collar, his knees scraped against the floor, and his eyes bulged with animal terror. The Emperor did not look at him. "Confusion," he said softly as the officer collapsed beside the others. "A costly word." Belrin remained motionless, though sweat ran down his temple and vanished into the edge of his collar. The projection shifted again, showing the last known trace of Sarah Vant. It was a transit record from the final days of the Republic, a forged clearance that had carried her away from Coruscant aboard a medical relief vessel. After that, nothing but silence. No rebel contact. No separatist remnant. No criminal syndicate ledger bearing her name. To Imperial intelligence, such absence was almost proof of death, but to Palpatine, it was proof of skill. He turned away from the officers and faced the rain once more. In the window's reflection, the star map hovered over his shoulder like a phantom crown. He remembered the fall of the Jedi Temple, the roar of burning archives, the bright arrogance of the Order, extinguished beneath clone boots and Vader's blade. Amid that grand design, some mortal clerk had slipped through a crack too small for empires to notice. The thought should have been beneath him, yet it remained. "Lord Vader is aboard the Executor," Palpatine said. "Send him the file. He will recover the Veil Wake Array, locate Sarah Vant if she lives, and bring both before me." Belrin bowed until his forehead nearly touched the floor. "At once, Your Majesty." He did not rise until the Emperor dismissed him with a glance, and even then he gathered the archive cylinder, as though it had become a living thing that might bite. When the chamber was empty, save for the dead officer and the Red Guards standing silent as statues, Palpatine let the last fragments of the projection fade. He closed his eyes and reached outward through the Force, through the storm and steel, through the endless fear of Coruscant. He sought a tremor, a hidden mind, a forgotten thread tied to the old Republic and to the vanished roots beyond the edge of certainty. For a moment there was nothing. Then faintly, far beyond the ordered heart of the Empire, something resisted his touch. It was not the bright defiance of a Jedi, nor the crude flame of rebellion. It was a door closing in darkness, quick and deliberate, leaving only the echo of a will that had learned to survive by never being seen. Palpatine opened his eyes, and a thin smile crept across his mouth. "So," he whispered to the rain and to the vast machine of his empire, "there you are." The executor cut through hyperspace like a blade driven into blue fire. Within its armored hull, thousands of officers and crew moved with practiced precision, every corridor alive with the measured rhythm of the Imperial Navy. The vast star dreadnought was more than a warship. It was a city forged for conquest, where every deck echoed with discipline and every viewport framed the endless river of stars. At its center, surrounded by silence that seemed almost unnatural amid so much machinery, Darth Vader stood within his meditation chamber as the Emperor's transmission reached him. The black helmet rested upon its support frame while mechanical arms maintained the damaged body imprisoned inside the armor. Scars crossed pale flesh that no physician could heal, reminders of flames on Mustafar that even the dark side had never erased. Vader's eyes remained closed as the hologram of Emperor Palpatine floated before him, delivering the assignment with deliberate calm. There was no wasted explanation, no praise, and no warning, for none were needed between master and apprentice. When the transmission ended, Vader remained motionless for several breaths before the chamber slowly lowered his helmet over his head, sealing him once more behind the familiar breath of the respirator. Admiral Kendall Ozzel waited outside the chamber with 2 officers from Imperial Intelligence. Neither man had spoken while waiting, and neither welcomed the task of briefing Lord Vader directly. As the great door opened with a deep metallic groan, both instinctively lowered their gaze. Vader emerged without haste, his cape flowing behind him, and the corridor itself seemed to shrink beneath his presence. "Report," he commanded, and the single word carried enough weight to silence every nearby conversation. The senior intelligence officer activated a compact hollow projector. Project Veilwake originated approximately 24 years ago under Republic Strategic Navigation Command. Its stated purpose was the development of advanced hyperspace prediction algorithms, though recovered fragments suggest the true objective was considerably more ambitious. The projection displayed fragmented charts, encrypted notes, and faded images of laboratory complexes long since erased from official records. Our investigators believe the array was capable of identifying naturally concealed hyperspace passages inaccessible through conventional astrogation. Vader watched the projection without visible reaction, though memory stirred beneath the mask. During the Clone Wars, he had been Anakin Skywalker, hero of the Republic, entrusted with countless military operations and secret missions. Yet he had never heard the name Veilwake. Chancellor Palpatine had known nearly every classified project worth knowing, and Anakin himself had often been assigned where sensitive discoveries required Jedi intervention. The omission was not merely unusual. It suggested that someone within the Republic had successfully hidden an operation from both the Jedi Council and the Supreme Chancellor. "The surviving personnel?" Vader asked. The officer hesitated only briefly. "All accounted for, except one. Republic intelligence analyst Sarah Vant, officially presumed dead during the events surrounding Order 66, though no physical confirmation exists." Another image appeared, showing a woman in her early 30s dressed in the plain uniform of Republic intelligence. Dark hair framed a face that betrayed little emotion, and sharp gray eyes looked directly into the recording lens with quiet confidence. She possessed none of the heroic appearance associated with soldiers or Jedi. She looked like the sort of woman countless beings might pass in a Senate corridor without ever remembering her face. Vader studied the image longer than expected. Intelligence analysts rarely disappeared so completely. Rebels left trails, smugglers accumulated debts, mercenaries sold their talents somewhere eventually. Even fugitives made mistakes that Imperial databases patiently collected over years. Sarah Vaunt had become invisible, and invisibility on that scale demanded careful preparation rather than luck. Someone had taught her how empires searched, and she had spent decades ensuring she remained outside every pattern. The briefing shifted toward the recovered evidence. Deep within forgotten Republic budget records lay several encoded maintenance payments issued to a remote listening station designated Outpost Kappa 9. The station itself had been officially dismantled before the Clone Wars began, but long-range reconnaissance now confirmed that fragments of its power signature had appeared only 3 standard weeks earlier. It was a whisper rather than a beacon, easily dismissed by ordinary traffic analysis. Imperial intelligence had noticed only because they were searching for anything connected to Vale Wake. "Your orders?" Ozzel asked carefully. "We investigate personally," Vader replied. "Prepare my shuttle. The Executor will remain beyond sensor range until summoned." Ozzel nodded immediately, though unease flickered across his face. Sending the flagship into unknown territory without its commander present invited risk, but questioning Vader invited something far worse. Within minutes, preparation spread across the vessel with mechanical efficiency. Stormtroopers assembled. Pilots fueled a Lambda-class shuttle. Astromech calculations filled navigation displays as officers rushed to meet impossible schedules. Far away, beyond the polished order of Imperial command, an aging light freighter drifted among the broken rocks of a forgotten asteroid field. Its hull carried old scorch marks beneath layers of fresh paint, while its transponder identified it as a harmless salvage vessel licensed in 3 different systems under 3 different names. Inside the dim cockpit, a woman adjusted the final sequence of an encrypted transmission before deleting the equipment that had created it. She worked with steady hands and deliberate patience, leaving nothing unfinished. Every tool returned to its place, every circuit dismantled, every fingerprint wiped from polished metal. Sarah Vant leaned back in her pilot's chair and closed her eyes for only a moment. Time had placed silver among her dark hair and fine lines beside her eyes, but neither age nor hardship had dulled the sharpness of her expression. She no longer wore Republic insignia. She no longer answered to any government or cause. The Republic she had served had died on Coruscant, and the empire that replaced it had spent 2 decades hunting ghosts without realizing one still watched from the darkness. A quiet alarm chimed from the navigation console. Long-range sensors had detected an unusual fluctuation at the edge of the system, brief enough to escape ordinary notice, but unmistakable to someone expecting pursuit. She examined the readings twice before allowing herself the smallest sigh. "You're faster than I hoped," she murmured into the empty cockpit. There was no panic in her voice, only acceptance that another move had become necessary. She reached beneath the console, removed a worn data crystal sealed inside a weathered metal case, and held it carefully in both hands. Within that crystal rested the surviving coordinates of Project Veil Wake, incomplete but still dangerous beyond measure. She remembered the laboratories hidden beneath frozen mountains, the engineers who had vanished one by one, and the final order delivered only hours before the Republic collapsed. Destroy everything. Leave nothing for the coming war. She had obeyed as much as time allowed, but one fragment had remained beyond her reach, buried where neither the Republic nor the Empire had ever found it. For 20 years, she had guarded that secret, not because she believed herself a hero, but because she understood exactly what Emperor Palpatine would do if he claimed it. The freighter's engines awakened with a low vibration that spread through the aging hull. Outside, loose fragments of rock drifted silently past the cockpit windows, while distant stars reflected across cracked transparasteel. Sarah guided the vessel toward open space, never noticing the tiny reconnaissance probe clinging to the shadowed underside of the hull. Hidden beneath layers of sensor-absorbing alloy, the Imperial device transmitted a single narrow-band signal across the void before returning to complete silence. Somewhere beyond the edge of the system, a star destroyer altered its course by less than a degree, and the hunt truly began. The Lambda-class shuttle descended toward the forgotten system beneath the shadow of a pale blue star whose light seemed too weak to warm anything it touched. Around it drifted fields of shattered rock, remnants of worlds broken apart long before the Republic had charted the region. Dust shimmered across the void like silver mist, masking small objects from ordinary sensors and scattering long-range scans into meaningless echoes. Vader stood behind the cockpit as the pilots guided the shuttle through the maze with unwavering discipline. He watched the darkness beyond the viewport, not because he expected to see his quarry, but because experience had taught him that the galaxy often revealed its intentions in moments of silence. The hidden probe continued to feed data through encrypted bursts, each transmission carefully timed to avoid detection. Lieutenant Ervas, seated before the tactical display, studied the readings with growing confidence. The target has reduced engine output twice in the last hour, he reported. She is avoiding major hyperspace lanes and changing vector after every sensor sweep. Vader remained motionless. She assumes she is being followed, he said. That means she still believes escape is possible. The lieutenant glanced briefly toward his commander before returning his attention to the display, wisely deciding not to answer. Within minutes, the probe transmitted something unexpected. Instead of continuing toward deep space, Sarah Vance's freighter altered course toward the remains of an abandoned communication station suspended inside the largest asteroid cluster. The installation barely deserved the name anymore. Solar panels had folded inward like broken wings. Antenna towers had collapsed into twisted silhouettes, and great holes scarred its outer hull, where meteors had pierced the structure decades earlier. Official records listed the station as dismantled 22 years before, yet faint energy signatures pulsed from within, intermittent and carefully concealed. The shuttle settled against one of the station's surviving docking collars, with barely a tremor. Stormtroopers emerged first, white armor catching the dim emergency lights that still flickered through the corridors. Their boots echoed across empty passageways where Republic technicians had once hurried between consoles. Dust floated through stale air, disturbed for the first time in years. Vader followed without speaking, and the troopers instinctively widened their formation, as though even they sensed that whatever had lingered here belonged less to the living than to memory. The station had not been abandoned as completely as appearances suggested. Several compartments had been cleaned recently, old debris stacked neatly against bulkheads to clear narrow paths. Portable power cells hummed behind sealed doors, feeding carefully rationed electricity into a handful of functioning systems. Lieutenant Ervis examined a maintenance terminal and frowned. "Someone restored portions of the internal network," he said. "The work is recent, no more than 3 days old." Vader laid one gloved hand upon the cold metal beside the terminal. Through the Force, he felt only faint impressions, lingering traces left by ordinary minds, carrying ordinary fears. No Jedi presence lingered here, yet the place was far from empty. The first blaster shot shattered the silence. It struck a stormtrooper squarely in the chest plate, throwing him backward into the corridor wall. More fire erupted from concealed positions farther ahead, bright crimson bolts ricocheting through the narrow passage. The Imperial squad reacted instantly, dropping into disciplined firing lines as blue-white flashes from their E-11 rifles filled the station with deafening reports. Metal screamed beneath repeated impacts. Pipes burst overhead, and clouds of steam rolled through the confined corridors. Vader neither flinched nor sought cover. He ignited his crimson lightsaber, and the familiar hum cut through the chaos like a living thing. The attackers wore mismatched armor, scavenged from different wars, old clone equipment mixed with civilian jackets and patched helmets. They fought with determination rather than training, retreating methodically from one barricade to the next, while laying down suppressing fire. They were not rebels. Their weapons lacked standardization, and their movements betrayed no military doctrine familiar to Imperial intelligence. Vader advanced through the storm of blaster bolts with relentless certainty, his blade turning each shot aside before it reached him. One defender attempted to rush him with an electro staff, but the duel lasted less than a heartbeat before the crimson blade swept cleanly through weapon and armor alike. The surviving defenders withdrew deeper into the station, sealing blast doors behind them as they retreated. Imperial engineers hurried forward to breach each obstacle, but Vader raised one hand before they reached the first door. The heavy durasteel groaned under invisible pressure. Bolts snapped, hinges twisted apart with shrieks that echoed through every deck. The door folded inward upon itself before crashing onto the corridor floor, revealing another abandoned control chamber beyond. Smoke drifted through broken consoles, yet the defenders had already vanished into hidden maintenance tunnels, too narrow for armored troops to pursue quickly. Lieutenant Ervis knelt beside one of the fallen defenders, while medical personnel confirmed there were no survivors. He removed the cracked helmet carefully, revealing the weathered face of an older human whose beard had turned almost completely gray. "No identification," Ervis reported after searching the body. No Imperial records, no chain codes, no military insignia. He paused while examining a faded pendant hanging beneath the man's collar. Only this. Vader extended one hand. The pendant floated across the room into his grasp. It was a simple Republic service token, worn smooth by years of handling. On its reverse, nearly erased by time, someone had engraved 3 words with careful precision: "We remember all." Vader stared at the inscription for several silent moments. It was not an official Republic motto. It belonged to no military unit he recognized, yet something about the phrase carried the weight of an oath rather than sentiment. Whoever these people had been, they had not fought to protect themselves, they had fought to delay the Empire. Elsewhere within the station, stormtroopers completed their search with growing frustration. Hidden compartments yielded food stores, medical supplies, and communication equipment, all maintained with meticulous care. Living quarters showed evidence that perhaps a dozen people had occupied the station until only hours earlier. Personal belongings remained behind, but every data terminal had been wiped beyond recovery. Navigation computers had been physically destroyed instead of merely erased. Someone had anticipated Imperial forensic methods and denied them every obvious clue. Then one trooper called for his commander. In the deepest chamber, beneath the station's central antenna array, stood an ancient astrogation projector, unlike anything currently used by the Imperial Navy. Dust covered its outer frame, yet its internal systems remained warm. Hundreds of transparent star charts floated above the machine in overlapping layers, many depicting regions omitted entirely from modern navigational databases. Most had been deliberately corrupted beyond repair. One projection alone remained intact, displaying a chain of isolated systems stretching toward the edge of explored space. Before anyone could study it further, a timed charge hidden beneath the projector detonated. The explosion tore through the chamber with brutal force, collapsing the ceiling and hurling shattered machinery across the room. Stormtroopers were thrown to the floor as smoke and fragments filled the air. Vader remained standing, shielding himself against the blast with the Force, while broken durasteel crashed around him. When the dust finally settled, the projector had become little more than molten wreckage. The surviving chart had vanished forever. Lieutenant Ervis coughed through the smoke as emergency lights flickered overhead. "She destroyed it before we arrived," he said, his voice strained. Vader looked toward the ruined machine, then slowly turned his helmet toward the darkness beyond the broken chamber. Sarah Vant had sacrificed an entire safe haven and every record stored within it, merely to deny the Empire a single piece of knowledge. She had not fled in panic. She'd withdrawn according to a plan prepared years in advance. For the first time since receiving the Emperor's orders, Vader understood that this pursuit would not be won through speed alone. Somewhere ahead, his quarry had already anticipated his every obvious move. The ruined communications station drifted in silence. Once the fires had been extinguished, damage control teams moved through shattered corridors, recovering the wounded, sealing ruptured bulkheads, and cataloging every fragment that the explosion had spared. Imperial technicians worked with relentless precision, yet each report they delivered carried the same conclusion. The defenders had left behind almost nothing of value. Every destroyed console, every melted storage core, every collapsed archive had been sacrificed with deliberate care. Vader walked through the wreckage without haste, his boots passing over scorched Republic insignia that had survived 2 decades only to be buried beneath fresh ash. Lieutenant Ervas stood beside a twisted section of wall where engineers had uncovered a concealed compartment protected behind 3 layers of obsolete security plating. "My lord, we found something the charges failed to destroy." One technician carefully lifted a thin metallic case, no larger than a data pad. Its outer surface bore no markings except a faded Republic inventory code nearly erased by age. Vader extended his hand and the case floated toward him before settling into his grasp. It was remarkably light, yet the balance of it suggested craftsmanship from an era when precision mattered more than mass production. The case refused every standard decryption sequence. Imperial slicing equipment failed to unlock it, and attempts to force it open activated internal countermeasures that threatened to erase whatever remained inside. Ervas looked increasingly uneasy as one specialist after another admitted defeat. Vader watched without impatience. Machines had limits, fear did not. He approached the chief technician, whose hands already trembled beneath his gloves. "You have exhausted your knowledge," Vader said evenly. "Now exhaust your imagination." The man swallowed hard, bowed once, and returned to his work with desperate determination. Nearly an hour passed before the answer appeared, where no algorithm had searched. The case was not responding to military encryption at all. Instead, its locks depended upon outdated Republic Civil Service authentication codes, systems abandoned before the Clone Wars had even begun. The chief technician entered a reconstructed sequence pieced together from forgotten Senate archives. Soft chimes echoed inside the container, and the seals released with a quiet click. Relief washed visibly across the technician's face, though he wisely said nothing. Inside rested only a single recording crystal. Its surface shimmered with microscopic fractures, suggesting it had survived more than one attempt at destruction. Ervas inserted it into a portable projector, and a holographic image flickered uncertainly before stabilizing. An elderly Duros appeared, dressed in the simple uniform of a Republic scientific advisor. Deep lines crossed his blue face, and exhaustion weighed heavily upon his voice even through the decades that separated the recording from its audience. "If this message has survived," he began, "then Project Veil Wake has already failed." The recording skipped briefly before continuing. "Our original mission was never exploration. The Senate believed we sought faster routes for relief convoys and frontier expansion. That fiction satisfied budget committees and concealed the truth." The Duros looked over his shoulder as though expecting interruption. "We discovered naturally occurring hyperspace corridors beyond the established network, corridors hidden by gravitational interference so complex that ordinary navigation computers ignored them entirely. Some passages reached regions untouched by either Republic or Sith records. Others led somewhere we chose not to enter." The image distorted again as static rippled across the projection. "We encountered evidence that someone had mapped portions of those routes long before our arrival. The beacons were ancient beyond measurement. Their builders are unknown." He paused, searching for words that never came easily. we recommended immediate classification. Not because of enemies waiting beyond those corridors, but because unrestricted access would tempt governments into wars they could neither predict nor contain. His shoulders sagged slightly. Some knowledge must remain buried. The recording ended abruptly before identifying the final destination of the project, or the location of the navigation array itself. Imperial analysts replayed the message repeatedly, hoping damaged fragments might reveal more, but nothing else emerged. Vader listened without visible reaction, though one phrase lingered in his thoughts. Someone had mapped those hidden passages before the Republic. Countless civilizations had risen and fallen across the galaxy, yet few possessed hyperspace knowledge surpassing that of the ancient Rakatan Infinite Empire, and fewer still had left traces that endured into the Imperial Age. If Veilwake had uncovered relics untouched since antiquity, then the Emperor's interest was fully justified. A transmission arrived from Coruscant before the analysis concluded. The Emperor's hologram appeared above the station's command table, brighter than the dim emergency lights surrounding it. "You have recovered little," Palpatine observed. It was not an accusation, it was simply fact. Vader inclined his head slightly. The archive was destroyed before our arrival. The target anticipated Imperial intervention. The Emperor remained silent for a moment, his hood concealing much of his expression. "That is precisely why she interests me," Palpatine replied at last. "Most fugitives think only of survival. Sarah Vant thinks in decades. She has prepared each retreat before taking the previous step." His yellow eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Find the pattern beneath her movements. She is not wandering. She is leading us somewhere, whether she intends to or not." The hologram faded, leaving the chamber colder than before. Hours later, the Executor resumed its pursuit, while the ruined station disappeared behind them into the darkness. Aboard the Star Dreadnought, Imperial intelligence reorganized every surviving Republic record connected to strategic navigation, frontier surveys, and forgotten listening posts. Analysts worked without pause, comparing fragments that had remained scattered across separate archives for more than 20 years. Individually, none appeared significant. Together they formed a chain of subtle connections stretching across the outer rim. One analyst noticed that several obsolete Republic weather satellites had transmitted maintenance requests years after their official decommissioning. Another discovered that abandoned supply depots occasionally received shipments under forged humanitarian authorizations. None of the facilities remained active for long. Each was abandoned before investigators arrived, stripped of useful information and left to decay. Yet their locations formed a rough arc across the galaxy, not random at all, but carefully spaced, like markers guiding a traveler along an invisible road. Far ahead of the Imperial fleet, Sarah Vant guided her aging freighter through the atmosphere of an isolated moon orbiting a gas giant whose storms painted the clouds with streaks of crimson and gold. The landing zone lay hidden within a narrow canyon where towering cliffs blocked orbital scans. Her engines cooled as she stepped onto the rocky ground, breathing air scented with iron-rich dust and distant rain. Waiting beside the canyon wall stood an elderly Ithorian wrapped in faded travel robes, accompanied by two silent droids whose frames bore the scars of countless repairs. "You stayed longer than planned," the Ithorian said gently. "I had to erase the station," Sarah answered as she handed him the empty metal case. "The Empire found it." The Ithorian lowered his broad head, sadness passing across his features, without surprise. Then the circle grows smaller. Sarah looked toward the darkening sky where the first stars began to emerge beyond the canyon walls. "No," she replied quietly. "It has ended. Vader is hunting us now, and once he begins, every refuge eventually becomes a battlefield." Neither of them noticed the tiny glimmer high above the atmosphere as an Imperial probe, no larger than a bird, emerged from hyperspace on a trajectory calculated weeks earlier, silently beginning its search of the moon below. Morning came slowly across the canyon, though morning was only a convenience of language on a moon whose thin atmosphere scattered the light of its parent star into pale copper bands. Long shadows stretched between towering cliffs, and cool air carried the scent of damp stone from rain that had fallen somewhere beyond the ridges during the night. The settlement, hidden within the canyon, was almost invisible from above. Its shelters had been carved into the rock itself, their entrances concealed beneath weathered overhangs and natural folds in the cliff face. From orbit, the place appeared abandoned. On the ground, it revealed quiet signs of careful life. Sarah Vaughn walked through the settlement with the familiarity of someone who had visited many times but never stayed long. Men and women paused from repairing moisture collectors or tending hydroponic trays to acknowledge her with silent nods. There were no formal greetings, no embraces, and no unnecessary questions. Everyone here understood the value of restraint. Most had once belonged to forgotten corners of the Republic: surveyors, engineers, archivists, logistics officers, people whose skills had mattered greatly before history swept past them without ceremony. The Ithorian, whose name was Tol Merrick, led Sarah toward a circular chamber carved deep into the canyon wall. Ancient support beams reinforced the ceiling, though much of the chamber relied upon the strength of the surrounding stone rather than modern construction. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with weapons but with carefully preserved data cylinders, navigation charts, and handwritten journals sealed inside transparent cases. The room smelled faintly of old paper, machine oil, and mineral dust. It was less a command center than a sanctuary for memory. "We recovered another cache last month," Tol Merrick said, gently placing the empty metal case upon a work table. His resonant voice carried the calm rhythm common to his people, yet beneath it rested unmistakable concern. Records from the Republic Frontier Survey most concern ordinary trade routes, but several reference Vale Wake under coded designations. Sarah stepped closer, scanning the arranged documents without touching them. "How much survived?" she asked. The Ithorian lowered two broad hands. "Enough to remind us how much has already been lost." One elderly woman looked up from a restoration bench, where she carefully cleaned the surface of an ancient star chart. Her white hair had been gathered neatly beneath a faded work scarf, and magnifying lenses rested upon her brow. "The Empire destroyed archives because they feared knowledge," she murmured. "Time destroys them because time is patient." Sarah recognized her immediately. Dr. Lena Voss had once overseen historical preservation for the Republic Senate, saving records no politician believed important until after they had vanished. Now she spent her final years preserving fragments the Empire did not even know existed. Sarah approached the central table where a holographic map slowly rotated above hidden projectors. Unlike Imperial star charts, this one contained handwritten annotations accumulated across decades. Tiny symbols marked abandoned relay stations, forgotten observation posts, and hyperspace anomalies erased from official databases. Several paths had been crossed out in red. Others remained highlighted in blue. Near the edge of explored space, a single route glowed amber, ending at an unnamed system represented only by an empty circle. Dr. Voss noticed Sarah studying the map. "We finished comparing the surviving navigation logs," she said. "The array was never kept at the research facility." Sarah looked toward her sharply. "You're certain?" The elderly historian nodded once. The scientists feared exactly what happened. They divided the project before the Clone Wars. The navigation algorithms remained at the laboratory, but the physical array was relocated during the final weeks of the Republic. She tapped the amber route. "Somewhere beyond here." Silence settled across the chamber as everyone considered the implication. For 20 years, they had believed the laboratory and the array to be one destination. Instead, they had spent decades protecting only half the truth. Sarah rested both hands upon the table, replaying memories she had not examined in years. She remembered hurried meetings behind sealed doors, frightened scientists arguing over evacuation plans, and encrypted orders delivered under emergency authority. At the time, she had known only the portion necessary to complete her assignment. Now she understood that even those directing Veil Wake had compartmentalized the project against betrayal. A warning signal interrupted the quiet. One of the maintenance droids emitted a sharp electronic tone before projecting orbital telemetry into the air. Small points of light drifted across the display, moving in expanding search patterns above the moon. The settlement's technicians gathered around immediately, comparing the readings against known civilian traffic. There was no match. Tolmeric's expression darkened. "Imperial reconnaissance," he said. "Not a patrol, a search." Sarah studied the pattern only briefly before reaching her conclusion. "Probes," she said. "Automated. They're sweeping by sectors instead of targeting settlements." Her voice remained calm, but her thoughts moved quickly. Vader had learned from the destroyed station. Rather than rushing blindly toward obvious refugees, he was tightening the net one careful strand at a time. The probes would not attack. They would simply observe until something worthy of attention revealed itself. Outside canyon workers began quietly shutting down non-essential equipment. Heat signatures faded one by one as generators entered standby mode. Moisture collectors folded against the cliff walls, and exposed vehicles disappeared beneath camouflage netting colored to match the surrounding stone. No panic spread through the settlement. Everyone had rehearsed such moments for years. Yet Sarah noticed something different this time. The routine no longer carried confidence. It carried resignation. She climbed alone toward an overlook high above the canyon where wind whispered through narrow cracks in the rock. From there, she could see the gas giant filling half the sky, its endless storms turning beneath ribbons of sunlight. Somewhere beyond that magnificent horizon, the executor hunted with patient certainty. Vader would continue closing every path until none remained. She had expected that possibility someday. She simply had not expected it to arrive before they uncovered the array. Footsteps approached softly behind her. Dr. Voss joined her at the overlook, wrapping a heavy cloak more tightly against the cool wind. "You are thinking about leaving," the elderly woman said. "If I stay," Sarah answered without turning, "everyone here dies." "And if you leave?" Sarah watched the clouds rolling across the distant world below. "Then perhaps only I do." Dr. Voss remained silent for several moments before speaking again. "History remembers victories. It rarely remembers those who delayed defeat long enough for others to survive." She placed one weathered hand gently upon Sarah's arm. "Do not mistake that for failure." Before Sarah could answer, a brilliant streak of fire crossed the upper atmosphere. Then another followed. High above the moon, Imperial landing craft emerged from orbit, descending through the clouds in disciplined formation. They were still dozens of kilometers away, invisible to the naked eye except as tiny sparks against the morning sky. Yet there were too many for reconnaissance alone. Vader had stopped searching. He had begun closing the trap. The first Imperial landing craft descended beyond the eastern ridge with the measured certainty of a military operation planned long before the pilots ever entered their cockpits. Their engines echoed through the canyon walls as distant thunder, growing louder with every passing moment until loose stones danced across the ground. Dust lifted into the air in slow spirals carried by the hot wash of repulsors that never came close enough to be seen. The Empire had chosen its landing zones carefully. Rather than descending directly upon the hidden settlement, the transports spread across the surrounding valleys, sealing every practical avenue of escape before moving inward. Vader intended to compress the search one step at a time. Inside the canyon, preparations unfolded with disciplined urgency rather than panic. Storage vaults were emptied, portable archives packed into weatherproof containers, and concealed tunnels opened beneath workshop floors. No one shouted orders. Everyone already knew where to go and what to carry. Years of hiding had taught them that survival depended less upon courage than upon preparation. Children were gathered first, then the elderly, while the strongest remained behind to dismantle equipment whose capture might reveal more than its destruction. Sarah returned from the overlook and crossed the settlement with swift, deliberate strides. She paused beside Tol Merrick, who directed volunteers loading data cylinders onto compact repulsor sleds. "The archives leave first," she said. The Ithorian inclined his great head. "They already are." His deep eyes lingered on her face. "You intend to separate from us?" It was not a question. "They're hunting me, not the Circle," Sarah replied. "If Vader believes I've escaped alone, he'll commit every available resource to pursuit." Tol Merrick's broad hands tightened slightly around the edge of a cargo crate. "He will find you eventually?" Sarah allowed herself a faint smile, weary but genuine. "Perhaps. The important thing is that he does not find everyone else first." Dr. Voss approached carrying a weathered satchel whose age seemed greater than any object around it. The leather had cracked with time, and its fasteners had been repaired so often that no two matched. She held it out carefully. "You should take this." Sarah frowned. "I thought the journals remained here." The historian shook her head. Not these. They belong to Professor Dan Arlos, the last director of Veil Wake. They contain observations never entered into the official archive. Sarah accepted the satchel with unexpected hesitation, feeling the weight of handwritten pages inside. In an age of data cards and encrypted memory crystals, ink upon paper endured because no slicer could erase it. Far above the moon, Darth Vader stood upon the bridge of the Executor as the operation unfolded beneath him. The vast holographic display projected the canyon network in luminous blue, each Imperial unit advancing through its assigned sector with mathematical precision. Captain Loran, commander of the ground forces, gestured toward several converging markers. Thermal signatures remain unusually low throughout the region, my lord. If a settlement exists, it is employing aggressive emission control. Vader regarded the display in silence. They were hiding well. Too well. Advance more slowly, he ordered. Captain Loran blinked in confusion before recovering his composure. My lord? If they believe capture is immediate, they will destroy evidence. Leave them time to choose. The captain bowed. At once. Several officers exchanged uncertain glances once Vader turned away. They had expected speed, overwhelming force, and relentless pressure. Instead, the Dark Lord had deliberately reduced the pace of the encirclement. None dared question him openly, but Lieutenant Ervis quietly understood the reasoning. Desperate prey abandoned caution. Patient hunters collected mistakes. On the surface, Imperial scout teams moved steadily through narrow ravines, lined with ancient stone pillars sculpted by wind over countless centuries. Probe droids hovered ahead of each formation, their sensors sweeping every crack and overhang with clinical efficiency. Wildlife fled before the advancing columns. Small reptilian creatures disappeared beneath loose rock, while flocks of winged scavengers scattered into the sky, their cries echoing between the cliffs. Yet the soldiers encountered no resistance. The silence itself became unsettling. Within the hidden settlement, the evacuation neared completion. Concealed passageways led deeper into the canyon system than surface maps suggested, branching through natural caverns known only to those who had explored them for years. Families disappeared into those tunnels carrying only essentials. Workshops stood abandoned. Hydroponic gardens were left behind. Fires were extinguished until the settlement resembled an empty shell waiting for its first visitors in decades. Sarah entered the archive chamber one final time. The shelves now stood almost bare. Only damaged records beyond restoration remained in their cases, alongside broken projectors too heavy to transport. She walked slowly around the room, allowing her fingers to brush across the worn edges of empty shelves where history had rested in quiet safety. So many names had survived here because ordinary people refused to let memory die. Senators would never know these sacrifices. Historians might never uncover them. Yet the Republic's forgotten servants had preserved its soul long after its government had fallen. She reached the central work table and activated the holographic map once more. The amber route still glowed near the frontier. This time, however, she noticed something she had overlooked before. One of the handwritten annotations beside the route had faded almost completely beneath years of wear. Tilting the projection slightly, she caught the hidden lettering as the light shifted across it. not destination. Anchor. Her pulse quickened. The route did not end where the array waited. It began there. The realization struck with startling clarity. Veil Wake had never depended upon one extraordinary hyperspace path. The navigation array itself functioned as a calibration point, an anchor capable of aligning countless concealed routes whose entrances drifted subtly over time under the influence of changing gravitational fields. Without the array, even accurate coordinates would eventually become useless. The scientists had hidden not merely a destination, but the key required to reach every destination beyond it. A distant explosion rolled through the canyon. The chamber trembled. Loose dust drifted from the ceiling as another detonation followed, closer this time. Imperial engineers had begun breaching the outer tunnel network. Sarah extinguished the projection immediately and slipped Professor Arlos's satchel across her shoulder. There was no longer time to study the journals. There was only time to ensure they did not fall into Imperial hands. Outside, Tol Merrick waited beside her freighter. The old vessel's engines already hummed with restrained power, their familiar vibration resonating through the landing struts. Around them, the settlement had grown eerily still. Nearly everyone had vanished into the deeper caverns. Only a handful of volunteers remained to complete the final stage of the evacuation. "You've changed your route," Tol Merrick observed quietly. Sarah nodded once. "The array isn't hidden at the end of the trail." She looked toward the distant cliffs, where thin columns of dust marked the approach of Imperial walkers climbing through the valleys. "It's hidden at the beginning." The Ithorian understood immediately, though sorrow shadowed his broad features. "Then Vader is chasing the wrong direction." "For now," Sarah answered, "he won't remain wrong forever." Without another word, she climbed into the cockpit. The freighter lifted gently from the canyon floor, rising through a curtain of swirling dust before banking sharply toward the western horizon. Moments later, its engines flared bright against the darkening sky, drawing every Imperial sensor within range. Exactly as she intended, the freighter burst above the canyon walls with a roar that shattered the morning stillness. Twin engines burned bright against the pale sky, climbing hard before rolling into a steep banking turn that carried the vessel toward open atmosphere. Sensor operators aboard the Imperial landing craft immediately marked the contact, their displays flooding with fresh telemetry after hours of searching through empty terrain. Across the tactical network, dozens of confirmations arrived within seconds. The quarry had revealed herself. Captain Loran allowed himself the brief satisfaction of success before forwarding the report to orbit. "Confirmed visual identification," he announced. "Single light freighter departing the target zone. Pursuit squadrons are launching now." His confidence lasted only until Darth Vader's reply reached him through the secure command channel. "Do not engage immediately." Loran frowned despite himself. "My lord, we have the target in the open." Vader's mechanical breathing filled the silence for a moment before he answered. "Precisely. Ask yourself why." Aboard the Executor, Lieutenant Erva studied the sensor data with growing concern. The freighter was climbing at maximum acceleration, yet its course was almost too obvious. It neither concealed its engine signature nor attempted the erratic maneuvers common to experienced smugglers escaping pursuit. Every action announced its presence rather than disguising it. Ervis enlarged the tactical projection until the canyon system filled the display. Behind the fleeing ship, Imperial ground units continued advancing through the settlement exactly as planned. Then the pattern became clear. "My lord," Ervis said carefully, "the settlement has gone silent." Vader turned toward the display. Thermal readings had fallen to almost nothing. The scattered life signs detected only minutes earlier had vanished beneath the surrounding rock. Buildings remained, machinery remained, but the people themselves had disappeared as though the canyon had swallowed them whole. The freighter had launched at the precise moment the evacuation reached completion. It was not escaping. It was announcing itself so the Empire would stop looking elsewhere. "Seal the canyon," Vader ordered. "No bombardment. Every tunnel is to be searched." "And the freighter?" "I will pursue it." "You know that." Within moments, Vader's personal TIE Advanced X-1 launched from the Executor's hangar, its distinctive silhouette cutting through space ahead of an escort of standard TIE fighters. The experimental starfighter accelerated with terrifying speed, leaving the larger vessels behind as it descended toward the moon. Inside the cockpit, Vader remained perfectly still, while targeting systems painted the fleeing freighter across his display. It was already breaking through the upper atmosphere. He could have destroyed it with a single missile before it reached orbit. He made no move to arm his weapons. Far ahead, warning alarms echoed through Sarah Vance's cockpit. She glanced at the tactical screen and saw the unmistakable profile approaching from behind. Vader. She had expected pursuit by ordinary pilots first, perhaps enough time to vanish among the system's scattered asteroid fields. Instead, the Dark Lord himself had come. She tightened her grip upon the controls while the freighter shuddered beneath increasing acceleration. The aging ship responded faithfully, despite years of hard use, climbing toward space through thinning layers of cloud. Every vibration carried through the cockpit floor into her boots, reminding her that the vessel possessed limits she could not ignore. The stars emerged as the freighter escaped the atmosphere. Immediately, the battle changed. Space offered freedom of movement, but no place to hide. Sarah banked sharply around the moon's outer edge, using its curvature to break direct targeting solutions before diving toward the immense rings surrounding the nearby gas giant. Countless fragments of ice and stone circled the planet in glittering bands hundreds of kilometers wide. Sunlight scattered across them in brilliant flashes that confused ordinary sensors. It was dangerous flying. That was precisely why she chose it. Vader entered the rings less than a minute behind her. His TIE Advanced moved with unnatural precision, threading between tumbling ice boulders without sacrificing speed. Larger fragments drifted silently across his path, only to slide past by meters, as though the starfighter anticipated their motion before it occurred. Several escort fighters attempted to maintain formation, but two clipped spinning debris within moments. One exploded in a bloom of fire. Another vanished beneath a cascade of shattered ice. Vader neither slowed nor looked back. Inside the freighter, warning lights multiplied across the instrument panel. Structural stress, shield overload, port stabilizer damage. Sarah acknowledged each alert without emotion. She'd flown through asteroid fields before, though never with Darth Vader close enough to become a visible shape in her rear display. His fighter appeared and disappeared between drifting masses of crystal ice, emerging each time impossibly closer. She understood then why so few survived encounters with him. It was not merely skill, it was inevitability. A narrow passage opened ahead where two immense ice formations slowly rotated around one another like grinding millstones. Sarah angled the freighter directly toward the shrinking gap. Any ordinary pilot would have diverted immediately. She accelerated instead. The freighter scraped through with meters to spare, its starboard wing scattering glittering shards into the void. Behind her, the opening narrowed further as the massive formations continued their endless rotation. Vader did not alter course. The TIE advanced, slipped through the closing gap at astonishing speed, missing the moving walls by less than the width of a hand. Ice exploded behind him as the passage sealed completely. Even the Force could not have widened that opening. It had only allowed him to perceive the exact instant when flight remained possible. Sarah exhaled slowly. So that's how you fly. She'd spent years studying Imperial procedures, command structures, and tactical doctrine. None of it truly prepared her for witnessing Vader in combat. Reports described him as relentless, but reports failed to capture the unsettling absence of hesitation. Every maneuver emerged fully formed, every decision immediate. It was like fleeing a storm that had already calculated where the lightning would fall. Ahead, the rings began to thin. Beyond them waited open space and hyperspace. Sarah reached toward the navigation controls, entering coordinates she had memorized decades earlier. The calculations completed almost instantly. One final obstacle remained. She needed only a few uninterrupted seconds to jump. Vader sensed the intention before the freighter's hyperdrive engaged. He did not fire. Instead, he increased speed and swept beneath the freighter's flight path, forcing it upward toward a dense cluster of tumbling ice. Sarah reacted instinctively, abandoning the jump sequence to avoid collision. The stars remained stubbornly fixed outside her cockpit. He had not prevented hyperspace by damaging her ship. He had prevented it by denying her a straight line. A faint smile touched Sarah's lips, despite the danger. He learns quickly. Then every proximity alarm sounded at once. Emerging from behind the largest ice formation came not Imperial fighters, but 3 battered starfighters painted in faded Republic colors, their hulls scarred by decades of repairs. Without transmitting identification or challenge, they opened fire upon Vader's TIE, emerald laser bolts flashing across the darkness. For the first time since the pursuit began, someone else had entered the hunt. The first volley streaked across the darkness with startling precision, green laser fire converging on Vader's starfighter from 3 separate angles. The battered craft emerged from the shifting curtain of ice like ghosts from another age. Their Republic markings faded almost beyond recognition beneath layers of fresh plating and field repairs. Their engines lacked the smooth harmony of factory-built machines. Each carried a slightly different tone, the uneven rhythm of vessels kept alive through ingenuity rather than supply lines. They had waited in silence until the exact moment Vader committed fully to the pursuit. The Dark Lord reacted before the second volley reached him. His tie advanced, rolled sharply onto its side, the crimson bolts passing so close that reflected light flashed across the cockpit canopy. He accelerated through the narrow gap between two tumbling ice masses, forcing the attackers to spread apart rather than maintain a unified firing solution. One pilot pursued immediately. The other two climbed above the engagement, attempting to trap him from opposite directions. Their tactics were disciplined, practiced, and remarkably restrained. They were trying to distract Vader, not destroy him. Far ahead, Sarah saw the exchange unfolding in her rear display. "No." The word escaped before she could stop it. She recognized the lead starfighter instantly despite the scars covering its hull. It had once belonged to Commander Harlan Dress, a Republic reconnaissance pilot who had vanished during the final months of the Clone Wars. She had believed him dead for nearly 20 years. Instead, he had survived alongside others who refused to surrender their final mission. They had come because they knew exactly where she would flee. More painfully, they had come knowing they were unlikely to leave. She reached toward the communications panel. "Harlan, break off," she transmitted over an old encrypted frequency abandoned by the Republic long ago. "You can't hold him." Static answered first. Then came a calm, familiar voice carrying only the faintest trace of age. "We're not trying to." Another barrage flashed toward Vader. The lead pilot drew dangerously close before veering away at the last possible instant, deliberately tempting pursuit. The second starfighter swept low beneath Vader's engines, forcing him to adjust course by a fraction. The third remained farther back, firing only when clear opportunities appeared. Their coordination reflected years of flying together rather than military perfection. Each trusted the others without needing constant instruction. Vader understood within moments. They were sacrificing position to steal time. His targeting systems tracked the nearest fighter, but his thoughts remained fixed upon the freighter disappearing toward open space. Every second spent engaging these pilots widened the distance Sarah needed for a hyperspace jump. Ordinary commanders might have accepted the delay. Vader did not. The force surged outward. The nearest starfighter shuddered violently as invisible pressure gripped its fuselage. Warning lights erupted across the pilot's instrument panel while the controls resisted every movement. Harlan Dress fought to stabilize the craft, wrestling with the flight stick as though battling an unseen current. His engines screamed under impossible strain. Then the port stabilizer folded inward with a deafening crack. The starfighter spun away uncontrollably. "Harlan!" another pilot shouted over the comm. "I still have her," Harlan answered, breathing hard. "Stay on the mission." He fired one final burst before the damaged craft collided with a massive block of drifting ice. The impact blossomed into a silent sphere of flame and glittering fragments that scattered across the rings. No escape pod emerged. The remaining two starfighter tightened their formation without hesitation. There was no cry of despair, no angry charge, only quiet determination. Sarah closed her eyes for the briefest moment before forcing herself to look forward again. Harlan had made his choice long before today. So had everyone else still guarding the remnants of Vale Wake. If she turned back now, his sacrifice would become meaningless. She pushed the throttles to their limits. The freighter trembled violently as old engines demanded more than they had been built to give. Behind her, the battle grew even fiercer. One of the surviving pilots darted between towering ice formations, drawing Vader deeper into the densest section of the rings. The maneuver succeeded for several precious seconds. Tumbling debris repeatedly interrupted clear firing lines, forcing constant changes in direction. Yet every adjustment seemed only to sharpen Vader's pursuit. He anticipated each escape before it unfolded, driving the pilot toward increasingly dangerous terrain. The second defender recognized the trap. Instead of following the planned pattern, she accelerated directly toward Vader from above. Her starfighter blazed through the field at maximum speed, laser cannons firing continuously despite rapidly overheating. The attack was reckless by every military standard. It was also entirely intentional. Vader shifted his attention for a fraction of a second, bringing his starfighter around to meet the new threat. That fraction was enough. The first pilot broke free from the closing net and accelerated toward Sarah's position. "This is Kess," came the voice over the encrypted channel. "You're clear for the jump. I won't leave you. You already know you must." Sarah's hands tightened around the controls. Ahead lay open space at last. No drifting ice, no tumbling debris, only the endless black between stars. The navigation computer chimed. Jump solution complete. She reached toward the hyperdrive controls. Then another voice interrupted the channel. Soft, measured, mechanical. "You have served your purpose." The transmission had not come through her communicator. It came through theirs. Vader's fighter swept beneath Kess's starboard wing with impossible speed. Crimson laser fire flashed once, impossibly accurate. The aging Republic starfighter broke apart behind Sarah's freighter, its engine section erupting into brilliant white light before dissolving into expanding clouds of molten metal. Debris hammered harmlessly against the freighter's rear shields. Silence filled the channel. Only one defender remained. She did not retreat. Instead, she turned directly toward Vader, accelerating head-on without transmitting a single word. Sarah understood. The last pilot intended to ram him. "No," she cried, though no one could hear her in time. The two starfighters closed with terrifying speed. At the final instant, Vader rolled aside by the narrowest margin. The Republic pilot adjusted instantly, matching the movement with astonishing reflexes. For one heartbeat, it seemed she might actually strike him. Then the Force intervened. Her controls froze. The starfighter drifted half a degree off course. It was enough. The vessels passed within meters of one another. Vader extended one gloved hand. The Republic fighter crumpled in upon itself as though seized by a giant invisible fist. Metal folded, wings twisted. The cockpit collapsed before the ship exploded into a cloud of burning fragments that disappeared among the glittering rings. Nothing remained between Darth Vader and Sarah Vant. She looked once into the rear display. Then she engaged the hyperdrive. Stars stretched into brilliant white lines. The freighter vanished into hyperspace, leaving Vader alone amid drifting ice and the fading embers of 3 pilots who had delayed the Empire by less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes that somewhere ahead along an ancient forgotten route might prove to be the most valuable time in the galaxy. Hyperspace engulfed the freighter in its familiar river of blue-white light, yet Sarah Vaught found no comfort in the sight. The engines settled into their steady vibration, and the violent alarms that had filled the cockpit only moments before faded into quieter warnings of overheating systems and structural fatigue. Smoke drifted from an overloaded power relay beneath the navigation console, carrying the sharp scent of scorched insulation through the cramped compartment. She lowered the throttles by instinct, though there was little they could accomplish now. The ship was committed to its course until she chose to emerge. And for the first time in hours, no one was firing at her. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute. 1 minute to mourn. The names came to her without effort. Harlan Dreskes, Arden, Nayla Voss, 3 pilots who had once flown reconnaissance missions for the Republic Navy, 3 ordinary officers who had survived the collapse of the government they had sworn to protect. None of them had become generals or heroes remembered in history. They had simply refused to abandon the promise they made when Project Veilwake was sealed away. Their sacrifice had not surprised her. That was what hurt most. The cockpit remained quiet except for the endless murmur of the hyperdrive. Sarah reached across the console and opened the weathered satchel Dr. Voss had entrusted to her. Inside lay several carefully wrapped journals bound in faded brown leather, each marked only by a year and the initials DA. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old ink, preserved with remarkable care despite decades of travel. She selected the final volume and opened it gently, finding handwriting so neat it resembled architectural drawings more than personal notes. Professor Den Arlos had written without ornament, recording observations with the discipline of a scientist and the caution of a man who expected others to read his work after his death. Early entries described hyperspace equations beyond Sarah's expertise, followed by increasingly detailed accounts of the corridors discovered beyond known routes. As the journal progressed, the tone changed almost imperceptibly. Calculations gave way to concern. Technical certainty yielded to careful warnings. The professor had begun writing less as a researcher and more as a guardian. One passage drew her attention immediately. The corridors do not remain fixed. They breathe. She frowned. The following pages explained. According to Veilwake's observations, the hidden routes shifted over time beneath the influence of distant gravitational forces too subtle for ordinary navigation systems to detect. A passage charted 1 year might drift thousands of kilometers by the next. The movement was slow enough to escape casual notice, yet relentless across decades. Without constant recalibration, any map would eventually guide travelers into empty space or directly through stars. Sarah leaned back slowly. The anchor. Now she understood completely. The navigation array had never existed to discover the corridors. It existed to find them again. The realization settled over her with startling clarity. Every surviving chart, every coded route, every sacrifice made by the circle preserved only half the knowledge required. Without the array itself, the journals would gradually become useless as the galaxy continued its silent motion. Veilwake had hidden not merely technology, but the only instrument capable of keeping its discoveries alive. An alert chimed softly from the navigation computer. The freighter would emerge from hyperspace in less than 5 minutes. Sarah closed the journal and turned her attention toward the controls. The destination appeared ordinary enough on modern imperial charts. The uninhabited Karen system, surveyed briefly during the Republic expansion era before being abandoned as strategically insignificant. 3 barren worlds orbited a dim, orange star. No colonies, no mining operations, no permanent settlements. It was exactly the sort of place bureaucracies forgot. The stars snapped back into existence. The freighter emerged into silence. Karen looked every bit as empty as the records promised. The primary world was little more than a gray sphere scarred by ancient impacts. Farther out drifted a frozen planet wrapped in pale clouds. Between them circled the third world, smaller than either companion, its surface hidden beneath endless rust-colored deserts, broken only by jagged mountain ranges. No ships appeared on sensors, no communication signals reached the freighter. Only the quiet hum of background radiation greeted her arrival. She guided the ship toward the desert planet. As altitude decreased, the landscape revealed itself in greater detail. Wind-carved mesas stretched toward every horizon, separated by valleys filled with crimson sand that shifted constantly beneath powerful seasonal storms. Towering cliffs rose like weathered fortress walls, casting enormous shadows across the dunes below. The planet seemed lifeless, yet Sarah knew appearances had deceived explorers before. Entire civilizations had hidden themselves beneath worlds far less forbidding. The freighter landed within a narrow basin surrounded on 3 sides by sheer stone walls. Engines wound down gradually until only the cooling clicks of stressed metal echoed through the hull. Sarah stepped onto the sand and immediately felt dry heat radiating upward through her boots. Wind tugged gently at her jacket while fine grains whispered across the ground around her feet. The air carried no scent beyond dust, baked beneath an unforgiving sun. She walked toward the basin's western edge. There, half buried beneath centuries of drifting sand, stood the remains of an ancient beacon. Most of its upper structure had collapsed long ago. Corrosion covered exposed metal, and one support tower leaned precariously against a weathered outcrop. Yet beneath the damage, she recognized the design immediately. Republic construction, not military. Survey Corps. She brushed away layers of sand until faded lettering emerged across the foundation. Karen Primary Reference Station. Commissioned 18 years before the Clone Wars. Decommissioned 17 years before the Clone Wars. She stared at the dates. 1 year. The station had officially existed for only a single year before disappearing from every meaningful record. Exactly when Project Veilwake had entered its deepest phase, a quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. You took longer than expected? Sarah spun instantly, one hand moving toward the concealed blaster beneath her jacket. An old man stood upon the ridge, overlooking the basin. His robes matched the color of the surrounding stone so perfectly that he might have remained invisible had he not spoken. White hair stirred gently in the wind, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent far more time beneath open skies than within buildings. He carried no visible weapon. Instead, he leaned lightly upon a polished walking staff fashioned from dark wood, unlike any tree native to the desert. Sarah did not lower her guard. I know you, she said quietly. The old man inclined his head. We met only once. She searched her memory. Then she found it. The Veil Wake Laboratory. A visiting consultant. A specialist in long-range stellar drift. Professor Kaylin Rowe, officially declared dead 23 years earlier. "You survived," she whispered him. "I remained." The distinction caught her attention immediately. Before she could ask another question, the old professor looked calmly toward the eastern horizon. "They followed you," he said. Sarah turned. Far beyond the desert, almost too distant to distinguish from the shimmering heat, several tiny black shapes descended through the atmosphere. Imperial landing craft. Vader had found Karen. The distant shapes grew steadily larger against the burning sky, descending with deliberate precision rather than reckless speed. Their engines left pale trails through the thin atmosphere before fading as the pilots adjusted for landing. Even from this distance, Sarah recognized the disciplined spacing between the craft. Imperial formations never relied upon spectacle. Every angle, every interval, every approach vector served a calculated purpose. Vader had not merely found Karen. He had arrived expecting resistance. Professor Kaylin Rowe watched the approaching transports without visible alarm. Wind tugged gently at his weathered robes, yet his posture remained relaxed, almost patient, as though he had spent years expecting this exact moment. "You still have time," he said quietly. Sarah turned toward him in disbelief. "Those ships will be here within minutes." The old scientist nodded once. "Minutes are sometimes enough. That was always the foundation of Veil Wake." He descended into the basin with careful, measured steps, using the walking staff less from necessity than habit. Reaching the half-buried beacon, he brushed away another layer of sand until a circular control panel emerged beneath centuries of dust. Its power cells should have failed decades earlier, yet, when he placed his hand upon the surface, a faint blue light awakened beneath the cracked transparasteel. Hidden mechanisms stirred somewhere deep below the desert. Stone shifted with a dull rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. The basin trembled. A narrow seam opened across the desert floor, perfectly straight despite the uneven terrain surrounding it. Sand poured into the widening gap, like water disappearing into an unseen river. Ancient machinery groaned below, awakening after decades of silence, while columns of compressed air burst upward through hidden vents. Slowly, impossibly, a circular platform began rising from beneath the planet's surface. Dust cascaded from its edges in shimmering curtains, revealing smooth alloy, untouched by corrosion or age. Sarah stared in silence. The platform carried no weapons, no defensive batteries, no towering laboratory. At its center stood a single structure resembling an immense astrogation instrument formed from concentric rings of polished metal surrounding a crystal sphere suspended without visible support. Delicate conduits spread outward beneath the rings like roots beneath fertile soil, disappearing into the platform itself. The device stood nearly 15 meters tall, elegant rather than imposing, its proportions suggesting careful craftsmanship rather than military engineering. "The anchor," Sarah whispered. Professor Rowe smiled faintly. "The first one?" She looked toward him sharply. "First? There were never plans to build only one. The Republic authorized 6 calibration arrays positioned across distant sectors. His expression darkened with memory. Only this prototype became operational before the Clone Wars consumed everything else. The remaining 5 existed only as blueprints. The crystal sphere awakened. Soft white light spread through its interior before flowing outward into the surrounding rings. One by one, they began rotating at different speeds, producing a low harmonic tone that resonated through the desert air. Holographic stars appeared above the device, not projected from hidden emitters, but emerging directly from the glowing crystal itself. Thousands of points of light arranged themselves into an intricate three-dimensional map, unlike any Sarah had ever seen. It was not a map of planets. It was a map of movement. Brilliant threads of blue curved invisibly between familiar star systems, weaving through space in graceful arcs before vanishing into regions left blank upon every standard chart. Some shifted slowly before her eyes. Others faded while new paths emerged elsewhere, responding to gravitational currents too subtle for ordinary perception. The hidden hyperspace corridors lived. They drifted constantly, reshaping themselves across the galaxy with patient inevitability. Professor Rowe stepped toward the array. "For 23 years," he said softly, "I have recalibrated these routes every 12 standard days." Sarah looked at him in astonishment. "Alone?" "I had help." He glanced toward the surrounding cliffs. Only then did Sarah notice them. Figures emerged silently from concealed shelters carved into the stone, dozens of men and women dressed in plain desert clothing faded by sun and sand. Some carried tools, others bore sealed data cases or replacement components worn smooth by years of careful maintenance. There were no soldiers among them. They were technicians, surveyors, engineers, mathematicians, the last surviving members of the original Veilwake staff. Not all had died. Some had simply vanished. "They stayed," Professor Rowe continued. "The Republic disappeared. The Empire rose. The rebellion began fighting its own war. We remained here because the array could never be abandoned." He rested one hand gently against the polished metal ring nearest him. "Machines this complex require human judgment. No automated system can account for every stellar drift." A sharp crack echoed across the basin. Everyone froze. Far above, on the ridge overlooking the hidden platform, the first squad of Imperial scout troopers appeared. Their white armor gleamed beneath the afternoon sun as they spread into disciplined firing positions. More soldiers followed close behind, advancing with practiced caution while probe droids drifted overhead, transmitting every image directly to orbit. The scouts had not yet opened fire. They had discovered something too valuable to risk damaging through haste. Moments later, another figure stepped onto the ridge. Black armor, flowing cape, the unmistakable silhouette of Darth Vader. He surveyed the basin without speaking, his helmet turning slowly as the rising platform, the assembled scientists, and the glowing array came into view. Even across the considerable distance separating them, Sarah felt the oppressive certainty of his presence. The hunt had ended. There would be no further hiding, no forgotten station waiting beyond the next system, no additional years purchased through clever deception. Vader descended alone. He left the stormtroopers where they stood. Each measured step carried him farther into the basin while the desert wind swept crimson sand around his boots. The only sound was the steady hum of the awakened array and the distant hiss of cooling transport engines somewhere beyond the ridge. Neither side moved, neither side reached for weapons. The moment possessed an almost ceremonial stillness, as though the forgotten machine itself understood history had finally arrived to claim it. When Vader stopped at the edge of the platform, he regarded Professor Rowe first. "You concealed this from the Republic." The old scientist met the black lenses of the helmet without lowering his eyes. "From everyone." Vader shifted his gaze toward Sarah. "You destroyed records across half the outer rim." "I destroyed maps," she answered calmly. "The knowledge remained." "The Emperor requires this array." Professor Rowe's faint smile returned, touched now by quiet sadness. "No," he said, "he requires what he believes it will give him." For the first time since entering the basin, Vader looked directly into the luminous crystal at the center of the machine. The rotating pathways reflected across the polished surface of his helmet. Then, without warning, every ring surrounding the crystal accelerated. The harmonic tone deepened into a powerful resonance that shook the desert floor. Above the array, hundreds of hidden hyperspace corridors flared into brilliant life simultaneously. And one route, brighter than all the others, extended far beyond the edge of every known chart into a region of the galaxy neither the Republic nor the Empire had ever reached. The brilliant pathway hung above the array like a river of living light, suspended between heaven and stone. Every rotating ring accelerated with perfect synchronization, and the crystal at the center pulsed with measured flashes that illuminated the basin in soft silver waves. Dust lifted from the desert floor, drawn into slow circles by invisible energy fields that spread outward from the ancient machine. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. For one extraordinary moment, every soul present gazed upon a map that no civilization had fully possessed since the array had first awakened. Imperial scanners immediately struggled to interpret what they observed. Probe droids hovering above the basin flooded orbit with conflicting telemetry, their processors unable to reconcile the shifting geometry unfolding beneath them. Routes appeared where moments earlier there had been only empty space. Distances recalculated themselves faster than navigation computers could verify. Aboard the Executor, technicians watched in disbelief as familiar sectors acquired entirely new connections before dissolving back into uncertainty. Lieutenant Ervas stared at the display in silence. He understood enough astrogation to recognize that this was not an illusion. It was a living model of hyperspace itself. Vader remained motionless at the edge of the platform, his attention fixed upon the glowing network. Through the Force, he sensed no deception within the machine. It was neither weapon nor trap. It simply revealed truth that ordinary instruments could never perceive. That truth alone possessed immense strategic value. Entire fleets could cross the galaxy along hidden passages unknown to enemies. Lost systems might become accessible. Fortresses thought secure could suddenly stand exposed. The Emperor's interest required no further explanation. Professor Kalen Rowe rested one weathered hand upon the nearest rotating ring. "It is beautiful," he said quietly, though his voice carried more sorrow than admiration. Every government that learns of it reaches the same conclusion: better trade routes, faster fleets, greater reach. None begin by asking whether they should possess such power. He looked toward Vader with calm eyes untouched by fear. The Republic believed itself wise. The Empire believes itself inevitable. The machine makes no distinction. Sarah stepped beside the old scientist and opened Professor Den Arlos's final journal. The pages fluttered gently in the warm air before settling upon an entry she had marked during the flight. He left instructions, she said, not for preserving the array, for ending it. Professor Rowe closed his eyes briefly, as though greeting the memory of an old friend. I hoped those pages had been destroyed. Sarah shook her head. He trusted that someone would eventually understand why. The old professor accepted the journal and slowly read the final handwritten paragraphs. The ink had faded, but every word remained clear. Den Arlos had anticipated the possibility that Vale Wake would one day fall into the hands of a government strong enough to exploit it. His conclusion was painfully simple. The prototype could never be allowed to serve as the foundation for an empire of any kind. If secrecy failed, destruction became the final obligation of those who remained. Professor Rowe closed the journal with careful hands and released a long, quiet breath. Vader took one measured step forward. You intend to destroy it. We intend to keep our promise, Professor Rowe replied. The Emperor will rebuild it. No, Sarah answered before the old man could continue. He won't. She reached into the satchel and withdrew a slender data crystal, unlike the journals or the Republic archives. It appeared almost ordinary, save for the intricate lattice of microscopic fractures shimmering within its surface. Vader recognized it immediately. It was the fragment she had carried since leaving the asteroid station, the piece of Project Vale Wake that had survived every purge and every pursuit. Sarah held it toward the crystal sphere without hesitation. This contains the adaptive equations, she said, not copies. The originals, every calibration cycle for 23 years, exists only here. She looked directly at Vader's mask. Without them, the array becomes an extraordinary monument, nothing more. The harmonic tone deepened until the stone beneath their feet vibrated continuously. Professor Rowe inserted the crystal into a narrow recess hidden within the machine's central housing. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every rotating ring slowed at once. The luminous pathways suspended above the basin began folding inward, collapsing toward the crystal sphere in graceful spirals. Light intensified until it became difficult to look directly at the machine. Stormtroopers raised their blasters instinctively. "Hold your fire," Vader commanded. No one moved. The array had entered a sequence unlike anything recorded in the surviving Republic documents. Conduits beneath the platform glowed white-hot as unimaginable amounts of stored energy surged toward the center. The crystal sphere no longer displayed hyperspace corridors. Instead, it reflected the faces gathered around it, one after another, as though preserving the memory of those who had guarded it across the decades. Professor Rowe smiled faintly. So this is how Den intended it. EQ? He placed both hands upon the machine. There is no stopping it now. The first fracture spread silently across the crystal sphere. Then another, Fine lines of brilliant light raced through its surface in intricate patterns until the entire core resembled a star trapped inside glass. The surrounding rings ceased their motion completely. Their song faded into profound stillness. For one long heartbeat, the basin stood, utterly silent beneath the blazing afternoon sun. The explosion never came. Instead, the crystal collapsed inward. Light folded into itself without sound, vanishing into a point no larger than a grain of sand before disappearing entirely. The energy sustaining the array simply ceased. The polished rings dulled, their metallic sheen faded into lifeless gray. Conduits beneath the platform darkened one by one until nothing remained except ancient machinery that would never awaken again. The hidden pathways vanished from the sky. Every navigation display aboard the Executor returned to ordinary space. The living map of Vale Wake was gone. Professor Rowe lowered his hands from the silent machine and looked at Vader with quiet acceptance. "It belongs to the galaxy again," he said. For several moments, Darth Vader said nothing. Then he turned away from the dead array and activated his comm link. "The objective is no longer recoverable," he reported evenly. "Secure all surviving records. The prototype has been lost." High above Karen, aboard the Imperial Palace on distant Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine listened without interrupting. His expression did not change. Yet somewhere behind those ancient yellow eyes, a calculation ended for the first time in many years, without the answer he had expected. The unaccounted variable had not escaped him. It had denied him. The sun descended slowly toward Karen's western horizon, casting long shadows across the silent platform where the Vale Wake array had stood alive only minutes before. What remained resembled nothing more than an abandoned observatory, reclaimed by time. The great rings no longer turned. The crystal sphere had vanished completely, leaving only an empty cradle suspended between darkened supports. Wind carried fine red sand across the platform, settling into narrow grooves that would soon erase the last fresh footprints unless someone chose to remember where they had been. Imperial stormtroopers advanced cautiously once Vader lowered his hand. Engineers followed close behind, scanning every surface with portable instruments, while intelligence officers photographed each fragment of the dormant machine. Their reports became increasingly brief as the examination continued. Power signatures had disappeared. Memory cores had fused beyond recovery. The adaptive equations no longer existed in any readable form. Lieutenant Ervas watched seasoned technicians repeat the same tests with growing frustration before quietly accepting what their instruments already told them. The Empire had arrived in time to witness history vanish, but too late to claim it. Professor Kalen Rowe remained beside the lifeless array without attempting to flee. Sarah stood only a few paces away, her hands visible, her expression calm despite the circle of blasters surrounding her. Neither of them had expected escape once the machine fulfilled its final purpose. Their task had never been survival, it had been completion. Around them, the remaining members of the Vale Wake staff waited in quiet silence, their faces carrying exhaustion rather than despair. Captain Loran approached Vader after receiving the engineer's final assessment. "My lord, the prototype cannot be restored. We have secured the journal's maintenance records and every surviving technical document found in the settlement. He hesitated before continuing. Most are incomplete. Critical sections appear intentionally absent. Vader looked once towards Sarah. She offered no explanation because none was necessary. The missing knowledge had never been written down in full. It had lived inside the minds of those who maintained the array, changing with every recalibration until no document alone could reproduce it. "You anticipated this outcome," Vader said. Sarah met the polished black mask without lowering her eyes. "I hoped for it. You sacrificed decades of work. I protected them." Vader considered her answer for several silent moments. He understood sacrifice. He understood duty carried beyond hope of recognition. Those truths belonged to Anakin Skywalker once before they had been buried beneath ash and armor. The memory stirred only briefly before disappearing beneath the discipline of the Sith. Still, something in Sarah's unwavering voice echoed across years. He no longer allowed himself to revisit. The surviving journals were loaded into secure Imperial containers under heavy guard. Professor Rowe watched them disappear without visible resistance. "Knowledge should survive," he said quietly. "Power should not own it." Lieutenant Ervis overheard the words while supervising the transfer. Unlike many officers, he felt no triumph in the operation's conclusion. They had captured paper, diagrams, and observations, yet the living heart of Vale Wake had slipped beyond Imperial reach forever. For the first time since joining Imperial intelligence, he realized that victory and possession were not always the same thing. As twilight settled over the desert, Vader ordered the prisoners assembled beside the landing craft. No executions followed. No dramatic display of Imperial wrath disturbed the quiet evening. They would be taken to Coruscant for interrogation, where the Emperor himself would decide their fate. The scientists accepted the order without protest. Some exchanged tired glances. Others looked once toward the dead array before boarding the transports. None asked whether their work had mattered. They already knew the answer. Far away in the highest chamber of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine stood before the endless lights of Coruscant, exactly as he had when the first report of Project Vale Wake reached him. Rain again traced thin silver lines across the great windows, and the city below continued its relentless motion without knowledge of what had been lost beyond its skies. Before him floated the final transmission from Darth Vader, accompanied by every recovered document, every scan, and every incomplete analysis. Palpatine dismissed them one by one with a slight movement of his hand. He had gained fragments. Fragments were not enough. For years he had believed the Empire possessed the galaxy because it commanded its greatest armies, its strongest fleets, and its deepest fears. Vale Wake had revealed another truth. A handful of forgotten civil servants, scientists, and surveyors had denied him something no military campaign could recover. They had not defeated the Empire in battle. They had simply refused to leave behind the one prize it sought. The Emperor closed his eyes and reached into the Force. The currents surrounding Karen had become strangely quiet. Where once he had sensed a faint thread leading into unknown darkness, there remained only absence, clean and complete. Whatever door the ancient array had opened had closed forever. He searched again with greater intensity, probing the distant reaches beyond known space where the hidden pathways had briefly shone. Nothing answered him. The galaxy had reclaimed one of its oldest secrets. Days later, Imperial records quietly classified the Karen operation under the highest level of secrecy. The official report described the mission as a successful recovery of obsolete Republic navigation research. No mention appeared of hidden hyperspace corridors. No reference survived to the living map or the ancient prototype buried beneath the desert. Project Veil Wakey became another sealed file among countless others inside the vast Imperial archives, incomplete even to those authorized to read it. History once again concealed its deepest truths behind ordinary words. Centuries of wind continued sweeping across the empty basin after the Empire departed. Sand slowly buried the silent platform until only the upper edges of its weathered rings remained visible beneath the desert sun. Travelers who someday crossed Karen might mistake them for unusual rock formations or forgotten ruins left by some vanished colony. They would never know that beneath their feet rested the place where the course of an empire had quietly changed without a battle, without celebration, and without witnesses. Emperor Palpatine had conquered the Republic, destroyed the Jedi Order, and bent countless worlds beneath his will. Yet among the innumerable victories that built his empire remained one small space where certainty had failed him. It was not marked upon any official map, nor remembered in any public chronicle. It existed only as an omission buried inside classified archives and fading memories, a single forgotten operation that proved even the most careful designs could leave room for one unaccounted variable. And in the vast silence between the stars, that was enough. If you linger with this tale after its final silence, you may notice that no great fleet truly decided its outcome, and no legendary duel determined the fate of the galaxy. The struggle turned instead upon ordinary beings who refused to surrender a responsibility entrusted to them long before history learned their names. That has always been one of the quiet truths of the Star Wars galaxy. Empires rise believing they command destiny, while the smallest choices, carried faithfully through years of hardship, reshape futures that no ruler can fully predict. The Force may move through every living thing, yet it often leaves room for courage that no prophecy records and no emperor can foresee. Power in this galaxy has always tempted those who believe that every mystery exists to be possessed. The Sith seek to master what they discover, to bend every hidden path toward domination, while the light more often asks whether some doors should remain closed. Neither knowledge nor strength is evil by themselves. What matters is the purpose for which they are claimed, and the willingness to accept that wisdom sometimes means leaving untouched what could easily be taken. The people who guarded Veil Wake understood that difference, and their victory came not from defeating Darth Vader in battle, but from denying darkness, another instrument with which to tighten its grip upon countless worlds. You may also find that loyalty wears many faces in this story. It is not only the obedience of soldiers or the devotion of apprentices to their masters. It lives in aging scholars, preserving forgotten journals, in engineers repairing machines no government remembers, in pilots who know they will never return from a mission yet launch all the same, and in friends who quietly carry the weight of promises made decades before. None expected statues or medals. Their reward was simply the knowledge that someone else might inherit a galaxy containing one less chain than the one they received. Such hope is rarely loud, yet it has always been one of the strongest currents flowing beneath the saga of the stars. There is another lesson hidden beneath the silence left by the dead array. Emperor Palpatine spent a lifetime believing that careful planning could erase uncertainty itself. Every rival could be manipulated, every institution corrupted, every war guided toward the future he desired. Yet the galaxy is too vast to be reduced entirely to calculation. Somewhere beyond every design waits a life overlooked, a promise kept in secret, or a choice made freely by someone history never expected to matter. That is not a flaw in the galaxy. It is the reason darkness never achieves complete victory, no matter how absolute it appears for a season. And so when you imagine the story ending, do not picture only the abandoned platform slowly disappearing beneath drifting desert sands. Think instead of a distant world, wrapped in endless rain, where an old emperor once gazed across the lights of Coruscant, believing every secret already belonged to him. The city still glows beneath storm clouds. Traffic still winds through its endless towers, and the rain still traces quiet paths across the palace windows. Yet somewhere beyond those lights lies one silence that even he could never command. And that small silence is enough to remind you that the galaxy has always held room for hope beyond the reach of any throne.